During the month of February, Set 8, Minerva Rising, and the Chronojet Stride deck set will be coming out. Set 8 will be supporting all the glitter ride lines from Set 5, and introduce 2 new glitter ride lines and make 3 new encounter ride lines with Minerva, Lucia, and Maelstrom. And then Chronojet comes back into the game, reintroducing strides to standard format. Here is the new tier list. This tier list is an updated version of my last tier list, and a lot of my opinions have been changed and I've been more informed about the format. So you can see there's a ton of changes here that this set didn't really cause. So if we look at all the decks that went up, there were quite a bit that went up in strength overall. There's also 7 new decks in the format, and then a lot of the decks that were in tier 1.5 got knocked down to tier 2 because of just how strong the new set is. Going into the first deck I want to talk about is Chronojet. So Chronojet becomes the best deck in the format whenever it comes out because the deck just does so much. During the early game, they have a lot of draw power and they're able to tutor a Chronojet to discard for Stride. And during the first Stride turn, they're able to draw a ton of cards between the combination of Brainwash, Swirler, and GG. And because of the crest, they have really insane scaling throughout the game because they can keep flipping over G units and keep having a big front row power boost that they can constantly reuse between the time leap mechanics and next stage going back down to Chronojet. And then the deck's main weakness is that it has a very slow early game. A lot of the cards are generation break restricted, so they can't do most of their skills until they stride. So the deck can run into issues of not being able to counteract plays from early on. Overall though, Chronojet is the best deck in the format because the raw power and draw engine they have. Moving on to the other tier 1 deck that moved up here is Ava. So Ava was kind of already tier 1. I thought it was still tier 1.5 during my last video, but now the new stuff just really takes it up and makes it, I believe, the second best deck in the format. So they got a new research order and a new obfuscate. So the research order is able to allow the Ava player to search their deck for more units they can call down, and then also makes Ava herself a base 23k attack. So the deck just got even more consistent on being able to find the exact pieces at once, and it gives it a way to call things from effects for both of the obfuscates to get the bonus effects off of. And those bonus effects give the deck more power during their turns, and with grade 3 obfuscate gives an extra crit. The deck is able to be set up and ready to play by turn 3 and be able to push the opponent hard very early on. And the deck is still naturally tanky through grade 3 obfuscate, and then Ava being able to dig for specific cards they want. So Ava can find either high shield value cards or sentinels to be able to use. So the deck's package is just so consistent and just works so well. One of the weaknesses the deck has though is it is very counterblast intensive. Ava naturally uses 2 every turn, and if your build still runs Combine Rusher, then that's another counterblast that can be used. So the opponent has a little bit more control over how much CB to give the opponent to be able to counteract how much they're doing. Next up, we'll move down to tier 1.5, and the top deck in there is Minerva. So Minerva brings in another Overlord clone of having a restanding Vanguard. This deck is really strong because of the really high attack ceiling it has, because of Chamomile being able to be called whenever you Soul Blast it off Minerva, and then Minerva also giving your front row plus 5k while it has a grade 3 in Soul. So on your first grade 3 turn, Minerva is able to swing 6 times. Now, most of those attacks are going to be pretty small, but the fact that it has this option to be able to play very aggressively is very strong. And on the Persona Ride turn, it is insanely strong on having that play set up and being able to push the opponent. The deck's ride line also fuels its combos and sets up the Soul very easily because the ride line has a Chamomile and Melissa. So the deck naturally has a pretty decent combo, and it's live on turn 3. And then because of the ride line, whenever you ride on top of them, you're able to fill your Soul up with more pieces and thin your deck out of normal units. So whenever you drive check 3 times off Minerva, you have higher chances to hit triggers. Some of the weaknesses this deck has though is that the deck naturally doesn't draw a lot of cards. Minerva restands with an extra drive, but you have to discard a card for that. You could high roll into finding a card off Drilling Angel, but for the most part, the deck won't actually be plussing that hard compared to something like Chronojet or Youthberg. But this deck does come online faster than those decks. And the numbers it hits up until Persona Ride turn is pretty small, unless if you hit triggers, then that can mitigate that pain point for a bit. So yeah, Minerva is going to be one of the better decks in this format, just because of the sheer amount of attacks it can put out and how much pressure it can put on the opponent. The other new encounter deck is Lucia. So Lucia is in tier 1.5 because it kind of does what it did in V series, but sort of differently. So a lot of Lucia's units gain a bunch of power to be able to push the opponent super hard. Just the deck doesn't really do anything turn 1 or 2 to be able to push for damage. But once they hit turn 3, then they start building up a huge advantage engine while also being able to push the opponent and filter through the deck. So Rising Dragon helps out with this because whenever it's played on Rearguard, you put a card from your hand to soul and draw a card. It's also a 30k beater with Lucia. And then with the new order Lucia gets, the deck is able to have 4 attacks where you can attack with, let's say, Rising Dragon twice and do Rising Dragon skill twice in 1 turn for that 1 card. And the deck is able to clear its field every turn, so decks like Youthbook and Chronojet can't send important cards the deck needs into the bottom of the deck, since Lucia is able to put them into soul. And the deck also doesn't need to commit a lot of cards in their hand, because Lucia is able to build a board out of nothing. The primary weakness of this deck right now is that it's very piece reliant, and it struggles to find its pieces early on until it starts to get going. Once the deck starts to ramp up, then getting pieces and finding them and playing them is a lot easier for the deck to handle. For tier 2, we'll start with Archite. So Archite's the new glitter line for Brantgate. Uses researches like Ava does, but instead it utilizes all the cards with monster in their name and turns them into big swingers. So the strength the deck has is that all of its rearguards have really insane numbers because of Archite being able to give them plus 10k every time you play one. And because of the new grade 3 monster, the deck has very easy ways to clear the opponent's field and snipe off annoying rearguards. This deck has a very strong baseline, but it doesn't have a ton going for it just yet because it doesn't have enough support. So one of the things the deck struggles with is it doesn't have a ton of draw power. You can thin your deck a ton off of monsters because of the research the deck got, but you aren't actually able to play them. You have to find other copies of them to get full use out of putting them in the order zone. And the deck only really has 1 card that helps it draw into its deck more, so the deck might struggle to find its pieces at all times. Next is Tamaya. So Tamaya got a new grade 1 Rirumi and Rarami, which increased the deck's floor, but the deck naturally has a lower ceiling than most other decks. Tamaya is probably the most consistent deck in Standard right now because of the existence of broken toys. Being able to find your dolls and put them into soul and then also draw you a card to replace that broken toys is very strong. And then the deck's Persona Ride turn is really strong because it can make 5 attacks, and because of Tamaya's skill, it gives plus 5k to your front row. So you basically have a 15k Persona Ride, and your twins are able to generate you different kinds of advantage by either minusing the opponent or drawing you a card. And then the new grade 1s add to this because you're able to call them out whenever you call out the grade 2s, and then they can also put them back into soul to be able to either countercharge or give more power to something. So the core of the deck just is smooth like butter and being able to constantly do its play over and over again. One of the weaknesses the deck does find itself in, though, is that it lacks flexibility. So the deck will never deviate that much from what it normally does, where you just call out a board of the twins and then you put them back in the soul and then pass the turn. There's a bunch of different variations of like what columns you could put the dolls in, but most of the time you're doing the same play over and over again. So when you need to play differently, the deck can struggle with that. And the deck's early game isn't that strong. It's mostly setting up and trying to find your pieces, so you aren't able to push super hard throughout the game up until you get to turn 3 where you can push a little bit, and then your Persona Ride turn where you can really slam on the gas and start hitting the opponent. Next up is Thagrea. Thagrea got the new Maple and a new grade 2 order, and for English we're getting its grade 3 set order. So the new Maple adds to the idea of having your Persona Ride turns being very powerful, and being able to create boards with multiple maples in play and push the opponent super hard. And because of both of the grade 3s being able to Persona Ride off each other, this deck is very consistent at getting to Persona Ride and being super powerful during those turns. And then because of the new set order, its Persona Ride turns are even stronger, because now the Persona Ride gives 15k power to front row and you draw 2 cards off of it. So you actually hard plus off Persona Riding, and your attacks just naturally hit harder. And then because of the grade 1 maple, it's able to be a 13k booster behind whatever you're restanding. And the deck still has a ton of filtering it can do from the Maple and Painkiller play. And now they also have Cabride / Cadrala to be able to do more of those types of filtering plays. One weakness the deck has is that it's pretty piece reliant. You want to find Persona Ride, which shouldn't be too hard. If you play the new set order, you want to find that. You need to find one of each maple. And then you also want to find a Drilling Angel with your Dark Thagrea to be able to turn your Light Thagrea on turn 3 and have it have its full potential going. So the deck just needs to find a lot, which it can filter through the deck pretty hard to dig for those pieces. It just needs to get there for the deck to be at full power. And then the deck doesn't also do that much during early game. Most of the early game is spent filtering through the deck and looking for pieces to try to find its high-powered playmakers. Next up is the last of the new encounter ride lines, which is Maelstrom. One of its main things is that it can continuously abuse Inlet Pulse, since Maelstrom is able to call Inlet out of Soul and give it a restand skill, and then Inlet can put itself back in the Soul and draw your card. And then Maelstrom's Persona Ride turns are one of the scariest in the game, because it makes so many attacks out of nowhere and can really push the opponent to either death or cripple them so hard the opponent struggles to make plays afterwards. And then once the deck is off the ground, then the deck can draw through its deck pretty well through Maelstrom drawing a card and Inlet drawing a card, and then your Twin Drive each turn. So you're able to go through your deck quicker once you hit turn 3. And just the ceiling of attacks makes this deck really solid. Some of the weaknesses it has is, again, it's piece reliant. You need to find a bunch of pieces to find all those attacks you're trying to get between Tile Assault and Algos, trying to hit numbers. And then you also want a bunch of your set order to power something up. And you also want Inlet to be able to draw more cards out of your deck. And you want Wheel Assault to be able to swap around your field to make more attacks. So the deck is very slow at trying to ramp up, but once the deck gets off the ground and finds its pieces and starts hammering the opponent in, then the deck is really powerful. It plays very similarly to how Thagrea wants to play. Last of the tier 2s is Rorora. So Rorora got a bunch of really cool support to be able to help the deck out. Between the new Raidolina being an actually decent finisher for this deck, the Powercraft Soul and Body condensation for the deck, and then a Inlet replacement really helps this deck get off the ground and start actually being threatening to opponents. So Rorora has one of the strongest grade 2 games in the format right now because of the line calling 2 tokens out, and then also grade 2 Raidolina calling out a Momoke token. You're able to just generate a field out of nowhere, and the Momoke token is able to attack from back row, so you're able to get 4 attacks off on your turn 2 while the opponent is on grade 1 or 2, depending on who went first or second. So this deck is really good at just pushing the opponent to a high damage count early on, and it doesn't need to commit that many cards from its hand just because of all the tokens they're generating, and then also the new grade 1 order that's able to revive something and call another plant token. So you spend 1 order to call 2 things down. And then because of Resolute Pair of Eyes, the deck is able to search for whichever Raidolina it needs and makes the back row stronger. So it makes the Momoke tokens and the plant tokens stronger boosters. And then any triggers you get whenever you attack with Rorora, you just pass the Momoke token, and then Raidolina will also gain that power, and then your grade 3 Raidolina will also gain that power. So you basically get 3 times the effectiveness per trigger on being able to push the opponent super hard. Some of the weaknesses it has though is this deck doesn't go through its deck very far. Nothing in this deck says draw a card unless if you're playing Inlet Pulse, and the only thing it can really do is search for Raidolinas off of Resolute Pair of Eyes. And then a lot of its costs is very soul intensive because you want to be using your Momoke token to boost up your Raidolina. So Raidolina Melina uses a soul every turn, and then grade 3 Rora uses a soul to call 3 plant tokens. And then the new grade 1 order is also a soul blast. So you just need a ton of soul for this deck to be able to keep doing its plays. But for the most part, Rora is a very strong aggro deck in this format, and I'm excited to see how it evolves throughout this season. Moving down to tier 2.5, I put Grahamgrace in here. So Grahamgrace is the main character's boss unit in Deer Days. The card itself is very overloaded because it is able to give its Persona Ride boost to its back row just by itself. You don't need an extra card to do that. And it naturally gives you 4 attacks while also clearing off a unit from your field and turning it into a card in hand. So this deck is just able to put on a ton of pressure once it hits its turn 3 and turn 4. And you're able to just get 60k power in play just from Persona Riding Grahamgrace. The weakness of this deck is that it doesn't have any direct support. There is a promo that gives Grahamgrace a drive, but we don't have it or know when it's coming out in English just yet. So until then, we're basically just playing a bunch of staples in Keter Sanctuary to make up for the lack of direct support Grahamgrace has. The other 2.5 deck in here is Chaos. So Chaos got a really good new Mikini because it can turn itself into your grade 3 Mikinis that you lose off putting in the soul. And then they also don't count as the same name in your soul. So you can more consistently get to that 13 different names in soul and more often have your Mikinis be usable again. And if you accidentally soul charge them, then you're able to grab them back. And then because of the grade 3 Mikini, the deck has very easy board removal, either just by normally calling it or using the grade 1 to call it. So the deck just has a lot more consistency going for it. Just one of the biggest weaknesses this deck has is that for the really harsh gimmick you have to play, which is being a Highlander deck and running a bunch of one-ofs in your deck, the deck naturally is less consistent on doing what it wants to do every game. And when you need specific pieces to do certain things, most of the time it's a one-of in your deck, and it is very hard to find it. So every time you play this deck, it's basically a lottery on what style of game plan you're going to be playing. The last deck I want to talk about is Shojo Doji in tier 3. So some of the strengths this deck has is that it's able to rush the opponent really well. The grade 1 Shojo Doji is able to set up your bind zone and put a card into your soul. And then the grade 2 gives you a free call and bind something. And a lot of the deck is grade 1s and 2s that is able to call more things out or help set up your bind zone more. So you're able to just have a really consistently strong early game to rush the opponent down. And the grade 3 Shojo Doji has a very unique way to disrupt the board because it can bind a column and it chooses the circle, not the actual unit on there. So you can get rid of things that can't be targeted by effects like Trickstar or Fasado. And then you utilize cards like Jakumetsu Arcs, which puts cards from the opponent's bind zone to the bottom of the deck. So it's a little bit of a harder way to bot deck things compared to Chronojet or Youthbug, but you're able to hit units that you normally wouldn't have been able to hit. Some of the weaknesses of the deck is that it has a low ceiling. The deck's power output isn't really that strong compared to everything above it. So the deck is super reliant on having a really good early game to be able to succeed. And then its other weakness is its lack of options. This deck only functions with stealth units. So there's at this point 8 sets of support for Dragon Empire, and Shojo Doji's only really able to use a small fraction of it. A lot of the stealth units aren't made for Shojo Doji and his playstyle. Now, if you like the aesthetic and how this deck plays, there is a promo coming out that makes this deck actually pretty solid and might put it in tier 2.5 or tier 2. So be on the lookout for that in the coming months. All in all, this meta looks to still be very Vanguard centric, like during the Worlds meta, and decks are usually trying to push for game on turn 4 and turn 5. So a lot of the best decks have a lot of consistency to their deck with really huge payoffs later in the game. So either being able to have a bigger payoff or have your payoff faster is really good, or just mindless aggro decks are also going to be okay in this format, since it's a bit of a slower format than we've had before. And that's about it. What are your thoughts on this meta? Anything in this tier list that looks off to you? Let me know down in the comments, and thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.